All right, picture this. It's January 1945, East Prussia. The winter is brutal. Snow blankets everything, and the wind cuts right through you. The Red Army, the steel fist of the Soviet Union, has finally crossed the border. They've entered Nazi Germany itself. The beast's lair. For a guy like Sergeant Ivan Gavrilov, it's been a long, bloody road. He survived the defense of Moscow, the meat grinder of Stalingrad, the massive tank battles at Kursk. 4 years of hell. He's seen his home flattened and his friends blown apart. What kept him going? Hatred for the invaders, sure, but also a profound belief. His political officer, the Polytruk, told him every day, "You are a liberator. You are the sword of the proletariat. You are here to free the German workers, who are enslaved by capitalism and fascism." Soviet propaganda assured him that the average German worker was starving, living in squalor. He expected to find conditions even worse than back home. Ivan's T-34 tank stops at the edge of a small village. He jumps out, PPS submachine gun ready, and approaches the nearest house. It's solid, brick and stone, with neat tiles on the roof. He kicks the door open, and in that instant, his worldview doesn't just crack, it shatters. He's not looking at a shack or a simple wooden hut, an izba. He's standing in a foyer with polished wood floors. In the living room, there are upholstered armchairs. A massive grandfather clock is ticking in the corner. A radio sits on a carved wooden cabinet. Thick curtains hang on the windows, not rags or newspapers. He walks into the kitchen. Copper pots hang on the wall. The stove is electric, a technology he's barely seen. He opens the pantry, and it's packed. Jars of fruit preserves, real coffee, bags of flour, and rows of smoked sausages hanging neatly. This isn't wartime survival. This is order. This is abundance. And then he sees the bathroom. Tiled walls, running water, and a toilet. A gleaming white porcelain flush toilet. Ivan has used outdoor latrines his entire life, literally holes in the ground. A deep, dangerous confusion washes over him. He looks back at the kitchen, the sausages, the electric stove. He thinks of his family back in Ryazan. 8 people crammed into one room of a kommunalka, a communal apartment sharing one filthy kitchen with 5 other families, where a single cabbage was a feast. A question forms in his mind, a question dangerous enough to get him sent to the Gulag. If this is how the oppressed German farmers live, then what kind of life have we been living in the Soviet Union? This moment, repeated millions of times across the Eastern Front, in the winter and spring of 1945, wasn't just a military advance. It was the beginning of the most severe ideological crisis in Soviet history. The Red Army experienced a cultural shock so violent that it fundamentally shook their belief in the system they were fighting for. They realized they had been fed a monumental lie. The military victory was absolute, but in the moment of triumph, the Soviet cause suffered a fatal wound. Part 1. The Soviet Bubble and the Sealed Reality. To grasp the intensity of this culture shock, you have to understand the world these Soviet soldiers came from. Stalin's Russia wasn't just an authoritarian state, it was a meticulously crafted, violently maintained, sealed-off reality. For the average Soviet citizen in the 1930s and early 40s, life was defined by scarcity and trauma. The previous decade had been catastrophic. Collectivization, the forced consolidation of farms to break the peasantry and fund rapid industrialization, had triggered devastating famines. The most horrific was the Holodomor in Ukraine. But starvation gripped the land from the Volga to Kazakhstan, killing millions. In the countryside, the kolkhoz system, the collective farm, was essentially a new form of serfdom. Peasants were tied to the land, paid often in meager rations rather than cash. They lived in incredibly primitive conditions, usually without electricity, let alone running water. The state took the grain at gunpoint, leaving the people who grew it to starve. City life wasn't much better. Peasants flooded the cities, creating a massive housing crisis. The solution was the kommunalka, the communal apartment. The Bolsheviks had seized the homes of the former bourgeoisie and carved them up. A typical kommunalka housed 5 to 10 families, each usually occupying just a single room. They shared one kitchen, one often broken bathroom, and one telephone. Historian Sheila Fitzpatrick, in her studies of everyday Stalinism, describes the atmosphere in these apartments as often toxic. Privacy was non-existent. Constant bickering over who used too much electricity, who didn't clean the stove, or whose turn it was to take out the trash. More dangerously, the close quarters meant constant surveillance. Suspicion was everywhere, especially during the Great Purge of 1937–38, when a neighbor's denunciation could send a family to the Gulag overnight. Materially, life was grim. The Soviet economy was geared entirely toward heavy industry, steel, tanks, and tractors. Consumer goods were an afterthought, characterized by chronic shortages and abysmal quality. People spent hours daily waiting in lines for basic necessities: bread, soap, kerosene, shoes. The concept of a consumer society was utterly alien. Permeating every aspect of this harsh reality was the propaganda machine. It was total and absolute. The concept of Zagranitsa, the world beyond the border, was mystical and terrifying. Soviet citizens were told, day in and day out, that they lived in the most advanced, most just society in human history. The writings of Marx, Lenin, and Stalin were treated as scripture. The USSR was the beacon of progress, equality, and enlightenment. The West, conversely, was portrayed as a Dickensian nightmare. Pravda, meaning truth, and Izvestia, meaning news, were filled with stories of mass unemployment during the Great Depression in America, bread riots in Paris, and workers living in slums across Europe. The propaganda insisted that capitalism was on its last legs, sustained only by the brutality of the ruling class and the rise of fascism. This wasn't gentle persuasion, it was total information warfare. Foreign travel was virtually non-existent. Foreign radio broadcasts were jammed. Contact with foreigners inside the USSR was strictly monitored by the NKVD, the precursor to the KGB. The average Soviet citizen had absolutely no independent frame of reference to challenge the state's narrative. They were true believers. They believed they were the vanguard of history. Historian Catherine Meridale, in her phenomenal book Ivan's War, emphasizes that Red Army soldiers possessed an intense sense of moral superiority. They felt sorry for the international working class they were about to liberate. When the Nazis invaded in June 1941, this ideological fervor was weaponized. The sheer brutality of the invasion, the scorched earth policies, the Einsatzgruppen death squads, the enslavement of millions of Soviet citizens as Ostarbeiters, Eastern workers, ignited a genuine and righteous thirst for revenge. The voice of this rage was Ilya Ehrenburg, a brilliant and ruthless Soviet propagandist. His articles were read aloud to the troops. He was unambiguous, totally dehumanizing the enemy. His most infamous instruction was simple and terrifying. "Kill the German." Ehrenburg wrote, "The Germans are not human beings. From now on the word German is the most terrible curse. We shall not speak, we shall not be excited, we shall kill. If you have not killed at least one German a day, you have wasted that day." The soldiers marched west with that injunction ringing in their ears. They were ready for a desperate fight against a monstrous enemy. They were not ready for paved roads. Part 2. The road west. The cracks begin to show. The cracks in the Soviet worldview didn't appear suddenly at the German border. It was a process of escalating realization that began as the Red Army pushed the Wehrmacht west, out of the Soviet heartland and into Eastern Europe. The first shocks actually came earlier, in 1939 to 1940, when the USSR invaded and annexed the Baltic states and eastern Poland under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. These areas had been independent capitalist nations, and their standard of living was visibly higher than the Soviet Union's. When the Red Army occupied cities like Lviv in Poland, now Lviv, Ukraine, the soldiers and their families were stunned. The shops were full of goods, shoes, clothes, watches, imported foods, and there were no lines. The quality of the goods was something they had never encountered. There are numerous accounts of the almost comical cultural misunderstandings that occurred. The most famous anecdote, repeated in many memoirs, concerns the wives of Soviet officers buying expensive silk nightgowns and wearing them to the opera or the theater, assuming they were elegant evening dresses. They had never seen such garments specifically designed for sleeping. That simple misunderstanding speaks volumes about the gap in consumer culture. But this initial shock was localized and brief. The political officers explained it away as the remnants of the bourgeois order, superficial wealth extracted from the workers that would soon disappear under the socialist system. And indeed, as the Soviets imposed their system, the shelves emptied, and the standard of living plummeted to Soviet norms. When the tide of the war turned, and the Red Army began its massive westward offensives in 1943 to 44, this exposure became widespread. First came the re-liberation of Western Ukraine and the Baltics. Even here, soldiers noticed the differences from the Soviet heartland. The farms were more organized, the houses better maintained. Then came Poland, Romania, and Hungary. Though ravaged by war, these countries still displayed a level of civilization that astonished the Soviet troops. Milovan Djilas, a high-ranking Yugoslav communist who spent time with the Red Army during the war, documented these observations in his book Conversations with Stalin. Djilas noted that Soviet soldiers were amazed by the relative prosperity of even war-torn Eastern European countries. The soldiers, he wrote, were surprised by the civilized life they encountered. They saw how peasants in Yugoslavia and Romania lived, often owning their own land, possessing livestock, and having access to consumer goods unheard of in the USSR. Djilas recounted how Soviet officers, the supposed ideological elite, were mesmerized by simple things. They would stare with childlike wonder at a well-made suit or a piece of jewelry. This fascination with the material often turned ugly. Djilas was appalled by the behavior of the Red Army in Yugoslavia, a supposed Allied country where looting and violence were rampant. When Djilas complained about this directly to Stalin, Stalin dismissed it with a chilling pragmatism. Does Djilas, who is a writer himself, not know what human suffering and the human heart are? Can he not understand it if a soldier who has crossed thousands of kilometers through blood and fire and death has fun with a woman or takes some trifle? But these weren't just trifles. They were evidence of an alternative reality. The experience in Hungary was particularly striking. Budapest, despite a brutal siege, was still a grand European capital. The architecture, the boulevards, the infrastructure, it all spoke of a world far removed from the drab, utilitarian reality of Moscow or Leningrad. A subtle shift was occurring. The soldiers began to notice an unsettling pattern. The further west they went, the better people lived. This directly contradicted Soviet dogma, which held that life was better the closer you got to the socialist motherland. The direction of history seemed to be running backward. By the time the Red Army reached the borders of Germany proper, the Reich itself, they had already experienced several layers of culture shock. But nothing prepared them for Germany. Part 3. The German shock, cognitive dissonance and collapse. If Eastern Europe was a surprise, Germany was a revelation. This was the lair of the fascist beast, the heart of the enemy, the source of all their suffering. And it was magnificent. The Vistula-Oder offensive, launched in January 1945, propelled the Red Army into East Prussia. This region is important because it wasn't the industrial heartland of Germany. It was largely agricultural, conservative, known for its well-maintained towns and prosperous farms. It was the perfect stage for the ideological shock that followed. The first thing that hit them was the infrastructure, the roads. In the USSR, the Rasputitsa, the twice-yearly thaw that turned unpaved roads into impassable quagmires, was a defining feature of life, a logistical nightmare that hampered civilian life and military operations. In Germany, they found a network of well-paved, well-maintained roads connecting even the smallest villages. They were lined with trees, they were straight, and then there were the autobahns, vast, multi-lane highways that looked like something out of science fiction. The soldiers couldn't comprehend why a state would invest so much in transportation for the general population. The visual difference in housing was staggering. The contrast between the Russian izba, wooden hut, and the German farmhouse was stark. German homes were built of brick or stone, with multiple rooms, glass windows, and tiled roofs, and they had electricity everywhere. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who served as an artillery captain in East Prussia before becoming the famous dissident and author of the Gulag Archipelago, captured this shock in his narrative poem Prussian Nights. He wrote of the eerie feeling of moving through this prosperous land, which, unlike the Western USSR, hadn't yet been ravaged by ground combat. Describing a scene in the town of Neidenberg, he wrote, "The houses are sturdy, the barns are full. We have never seen such wealth. How cleanly they live, how well they work." When the soldiers entered these homes, the shock intensified from the macro level to the micro. It wasn't just that the houses were well built, the contents baffled them. They found specialized kitchen utensils that mystified them: egg slicers, coffee grinders, mechanical mixers. They found matching sets of porcelain dishes, silverware, and crystal glasses. Clothing was another revelation. Soldiers opened closets and found high-quality, tailored suits, leather shoes, and hats. The discovery of silk underwear was particularly staggering. In the USSR, where basic cotton garments were often in short supply, the idea of wearing silk next to the skin seemed not just luxurious, but decadent. Vladimir Gelfand, a young Jewish lieutenant whose wartime diaries were published long after the war as Germany Diary 1941 to 1945, recorded his conflicted feelings. He was filled with hatred for the Germans who had slaughtered his people, yet he couldn't help but be impressed by the material culture he encountered. He wrote about entering a house and finding a library full of beautifully bound books, a piano, and paintings on the walls. This was the home of an ordinary middle-class family, yet it represented a level of cultural sophistication that only the highest Soviet elite could dream of. The realization was devastating. The fascist slaves they were supposed to be liberating the German workers lived significantly better than the victorious Soviet workers and peasants. This discovery triggered profound cognitive dissonance. It shattered the fundamental assumptions upon which their worldview rested. The central paradox that haunted the soldiers was this: if Germany was so rich, why did they attack us? Marxist-Leninist theory taught that capitalism inevitably led to the impoverishment of the proletariat, driving capitalist nations to launch imperialist wars to seize resources because their own populations were destitute. But the reality utterly refuted the theory. The aggressors were the rich ones. Lev Kopelev, a committed communist and a major in the Red Army's propaganda department, is perhaps the most important witness to this phenomenon. Kopelev spoke fluent German and constantly interacted with the troops. In his memoir, To Be Preserved Forever, Hranit Vechna, he recounted countless conversations with bewildered soldiers. They would ask him, "Comrade Major, look at this. Look how well they live. They have everything, houses, food, bicycles. What did they need our land for? Why did they come to us?" Kopelev found himself unable to provide satisfactory answers based on Soviet dogma. He saw the ideological foundations fracturing in real time. He wrote, "They had been taught that poverty breeds cruelty and war, but here they saw wealth, and yet the cruelty of the Nazis was undeniable. It turned everything they knew upside down." This confusion manifested in complex and often contradictory behavior. The soldiers felt betrayed not just by the Germans, but more profoundly by their own leaders who had lied to them about the state of the world. They felt an intense jealousy. They had sacrificed everything in the war, and yet the enemy lived better than they did. The reaction wasn't admiration, it was bewilderment and growing resentment. The realization sank in. The German slaves lived better than the Soviet masters. This ideological shock was fuel for the explosion of violence and looting that followed. The logic was twisted but pervasive. They lived this well, and they still attacked us. The sense of economic envy intertwined with the desire for revenge. When the soldiers saw the comfortable houses, it didn't soften their hearts, it hardened them. It reinforced the idea that the entire German population deserved to be brought low, punished for their prosperity as much as for their crimes. This partly explains the furious destruction that often accompanied the Red Army's advance. It was an attempt to erase the evidence of their own inferiority. Kopelev documented how this realization fueled the rage. When he tried to intervene to stop rapes and murders, arguing for the ideals of communist internationalism, he was met with hostility and suspicion from his own comrades and superiors. He recalled one officer dismissing his concerns, saying, "Why do you feel sorry? They live better than us, the bastards. They are all kulaks and bourgeoisie." The realization that they had been deceived by their own government also led to a collapse of the moral order. A sense of nihilism set in. If everything was a lie, then only immediate gratification and revenge mattered. Part 4. Davai Chasi. The Mania for Modernity and the Descent into Chaos. As the Red Army pushed deeper into Germany, the initial shock evolved into something else, an obsessive, almost maniacal desire to possess the symbols of this Western prosperity. It was a massive wave of looting that occurred on two levels: the chaotic, individual plundering by frontline troops, and the organized, state-sponsored dismantling of German industry. The individual looting is perhaps the most symbolic expression of the culture shock. The soldiers wanted to grab this better life and take it home. They took everything that wasn't nailed down. If there's one phenomenon that symbolizes this era, it's the phrase, Davai Chasi. Davai Chasi. Give me your watch. It became the most feared Russian phrase in Germany. Why this obsession with watches? In the Soviet Union of the 1940 seconds, a wristwatch was far more than a timekeeping device. It was a potent symbol of modernity, precision, and status. The Soviet industrial machine, focused on heavy industry, largely neglected consumer goods. A reliable watch was a rare and expensive commodity. Only high-ranking officials, decorated officers, or hyper-productive Stakhanovite workers might own one. But in Germany, everyone seemed to have a watch. Germany was a center of precision clockmaking. The realization that this pinnacle of personal technology was commonplace was mind-boggling. The acquisition of watches became a mania. It wasn't about utility. It was about possession. The iconic image of a Red Army soldier in 1945 is a man with both arms covered in watches from wrist to elbow. Antony Beevor, in his monumental work Berlin, The Downfall, 1945, describes scenes of almost comic absurdity mixed with tragedy. Soldiers would stop civilians, sometimes even concentration camp survivors, demanding their watches. If the person didn't have one, they might be beaten or shot out of frustration. The soldiers often didn't even know how to use them properly. Some didn't know how to wind them. It was a cargo cult mentality. The possession of the object was more important than its function. They were grabbing not just timepieces, but modernity itself. The famous photograph by Yevgeny Khalday of the Soviet flag being raised over the Reichstag actually had to be edited before publication. In the original negative, the soldier supporting the flag bearer was clearly wearing multiple looted watches. The Soviet authorities, realizing this didn't fit the image of the noble liberator, ordered Khalday to scratch the watches off the negative. That act of censorship speaks volumes about the regime's awareness of the problematic nature of the looting. The second great obsession was the bicycle. In the largely unmotorized Soviet countryside, a bicycle was a major asset. Germany, like much of Western Europe, was a bicycle culture. They were everywhere, sturdy, well-maintained, and essential to daily life. The fascination was immediate. For many soldiers from remote villages, this was their first encounter with personal mechanized transport. Memoirs describe the chaotic scenes that followed. The streets of occupied towns became impromptu training grounds, with soldiers wobbling, crashing into each other, and laughing with a childlike excitement that stood in stark contrast to the brutality of the war. Once they mastered the basics, the bicycles became tools for further looting, allowing them to cover more ground and carry more spoils. The looting often took on an absurd character, highlighting the depth of the cultural gap. Soldiers who had never encountered modern technology often had no idea how to use the items they seized. There are accounts of soldiers ripping electrical light switches off the walls, thinking the switch itself was the source of the light, not realizing they were connected to a central electrical grid. The fascination with the flush toilet is well documented. Soldiers who had only used outhouses were mystified by the plumbing. There are numerous accounts of soldiers attempting to dismantle toilets and ship them home. They saw the porcelain bowl as a valuable object, not understanding that it required a complex infrastructure of pipes and sewage systems to function. Back in their villages, these trophies became useless. Kopelev recalled seeing soldiers washing potatoes in toilets, thinking it was a convenient basin. This behavior cannot be understood simply as greed. It was a form of retaliatory compensation. The soldiers felt they deserved these things. They had suffered immensely and felt cheated by their own system. Lev Kopelev analyzed this psychology. They wanted to take everything. It wasn't just greed. It was a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between their lives and the life they saw here. It was a way of saying, "We are human too. We deserve these things." The Soviet High Command acknowledged and, to some extent, encouraged this behavior. It was seen as a reward for the immense suffering the soldiers had endured. The state formalized the looting process. A decree in early 1945 formalized it. Soldiers could mail back 5 kilograms of trophies per month, officers 10 kilograms, and generals 16 kilograms. The postal system was overwhelmed. By the end of the war, hundreds of thousands of parcels containing everything from nails and tools to clothing and jewelry flowed eastward. While the soldiers were busy with personal looting, the Soviet state was engaged in a far more systematic plunder. The NKVD organized specialized trophy brigades, tasked with locating and dismantling German industrial assets. Entire factories, scientific equipment, including the V-2 rocket technology that jump-started the Soviet space program, libraries, and artwork were loaded onto trains and shipped back to the USSR. The scale of this operation was staggering, effectively stripping East Germany of much of its industrial capacity. But even this systematic looting reflected an underlying recognition of Soviet backwardness. They weren't just taking reparations, they were acknowledging the superiority of German technology and organization. This culture shock and material plunder were also accompanied by a dark underbelly, massive violence and sexual assault. It's a topic that cannot be avoided. The atrocities committed by the Red Army in Germany, particularly the rape of women, were on a staggering scale. The reasons are complex: a desire for revenge, a breakdown in discipline, and the sense of inferiority and rage fueled by the culture shock. Confronted with German affluence, the soldiers felt a cheated rage, a cognitive dissonance that translated into a destructive impulse. Part 5. The Aftermath, Stalin's Fear, and the Western Infection. When the war ended in May 1945, the Soviet Union faced an unprecedented ideological challenge. Millions of people needed to be brought home. This included the victorious Red Army soldiers, but also millions of Soviet citizens who had been used as slave laborers, Ostarbeiters by the Germans, and the survivors of Nazi POW camps. This mass homecoming should have been a moment of pure triumph, but for Stalin it was a moment of extreme danger. These millions of people had seen the West. They had been infected by the reality beyond the border. Stalin understood that the Soviet system relied on isolation and absolute control over information. The Communist Party's legitimacy rested on the premise that the USSR was the most advanced society on Earth. Now, millions of witnesses could testify that this was not the case. These soldiers were heroes, but they were also potential dissidents. They carried the seeds of doubt. Even before the war ended, reports from the NKVD and frontline political officers were streaming back to Moscow, expressing alarm at the anti-Soviet sentiments spreading among the troops. One report noted, "Many soldiers express that life in Germany is significantly better. They praise the German houses, roads, and organization of agriculture." These observations, while true, were politically radioactive. Stalin's response was swift, brutal, and comprehensive. He needed to disinfect the population, reassert control over the narrative, and neutralize anyone who might challenge the official version of reality. The primary tool for this disinfection was the NKVD and its counterintelligence arm, SMERSH, Death to Spies. They set up a vast network of filtration camps across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Virtually everyone returning had to pass through these camps. The ostensible purpose was to catch spies and collaborators. But the real goal was ideological purification. The process was dehumanizing and terrifying. Individuals were interrogated for days or weeks. The interrogators were looking for any sign of ideological deviation. They were asked about everything they had seen and done during the war. Questions like, "What did you see in Germany? Did you interact with foreigners? Why did you praise the German roads? Why were you captured?" A simple statement of fact, "The roads in Germany are better," could be construed as a political crime, anti-Soviet agitation, punishable by years in the Gulag. The fate of former Soviet POWs was particularly tragic. In Stalin's paranoid worldview, there were no Soviet prisoners of war, only traitors. Order No. 270, issued in August 1941, had declared that any soldier who surrendered was a deserter, and their families were liable for arrest. Millions of men who had endured the hell of Nazi POW camps where the mortality rate was horrific returned home to be labeled as criminals. The logic was perverse. If they were alive, they must have collaborated with the Germans. The statistics of the filtration process are staggering. Of the roughly 5.7 million Soviet citizens repatriated after the war, about half were allowed to return to civilian life, though often under a cloud of suspicion. A large percentage were immediately conscripted into labor battalions to rebuild the country under harsh conditions, but hundreds of thousands were sentenced to the Gulag. Estimates suggest that between 10 and 15% of returning POWs were sent directly to forced labor camps, with sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years. They went straight from the Nazi camps to the Soviet camps. Their crime was survival and witnessing the outside world. Even the victorious soldiers who were not arrested found themselves under a shadow of suspicion. They returned to a country devastated by war and facing another famine in 1946 to 47. Their stories of German prosperity were unwelcome. They were told to forget what they had seen. The derogatory term Barakolschik, Junk collector, was used for returning soldiers, implying they were more interested in material possessions than revolutionary ideals. Lev Kopelev himself fell victim to this purge. Despite his loyal service and genuine belief in communism, his attempts to stop the atrocities in Germany were framed as bourgeois humanism and pity for the enemy. In 1945, while still in Germany, he was arrested by Smersh, convicted, and sentenced to 10 years in the Gulag. His crime was his conscience, and his inability to reconcile the reality he witnessed with the ideology he served. Stalin also needed to bring the military leadership, which had gained immense prestige and power during the war, back under control. The most prominent target was Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the architect of the victory in Berlin and the most popular man in the Soviet Union after Stalin. Zhukov, like many other generals, had taken full advantage of the trophy system. He returned from Germany with train cars full of spoils, furs, paintings, jewelry, luxury cars. It was common practice. But Stalin used it as a pretext to cut down a potential rival. In 1946, the trophy affair, Trofejная Dela, was launched. It was a purge directed against high-ranking officers accused of excessive looting and Bonapartism, a term derived from Napoleon, implying military ambition for political power. Zhukov was interrogated by the Politburo and forced to confess his errors. He was not arrested, he was too popular, but he was demoted and sent to an obscure military district in Odessa, effectively removing him from the center of power. The message was clear: no one was untouchable, and the spoils of war belonged to the state, not the individual heroes. The crackdown worked in the short term. The Iron Curtain slammed shut again, tighter than before. The Cold War began, and the state launched internal campaigns to root out Western influence. This included the Zhdanovshchina, a campaign against perceived Western influences in art, literature, and science, and the Anti-Cosmopolitan campaign, targeting intellectuals accused of lacking patriotism and favoring Western ideas. The image of the West as a dangerous, decadent enemy was reinforced with new vigor. Conclusion: the seeds of the empire's fall. The story of the Red Army's entry into Germany in 1945 is usually told as a tale of military triumph and brutal revenge. But it's also one of the most profound culture shocks in modern history. It was an event that exposed the massive gap between propaganda and reality, and fundamentally changed the worldview of millions. The great irony of the Great Patriotic War is this: in the process of trying to destroy fascism and prove the superiority of the Soviet system, Stalin inadvertently exposed his own people to the seductive power of Western materialism. The USSR proved it could build better tanks and mobilize a more resilient army, but it couldn't compete with the West's paved roads, well-stocked pantries, sewing machines, and wristwatches. Stalin tried to suppress this realization with terror and filtration camps, but the seeds of doubt planted in 1945 could not be entirely eradicated. The generation that had seen beyond the border carried those memories. They knew the official narrative was a lie. This knowledge was passed down subtly, contributing to a growing cynicism and disillusionment with the Soviet system. As historian Elena Zubkova points out in Russia, after the war, the encounter with the West gave the Soviet people a benchmark against which to measure their own lives. The shared sacrifice of the war gave them a sense of entitlement, a belief that things should improve, but the comparison with the West showed how far they had to go. During the thaw under Khrushchev in the late 1950s and early 60s, these memories began to surface. There was a renewed fascination with Western culture. Khrushchev himself, though a committed communist, recognized the need to compete on living standards. His famous kitchen debate with Richard Nixon in 1959 centered on the issue of consumer goods, a tacit admission that the USSR was falling behind. But the system proved incapable of delivering. The economic stagnation of the Brezhnev era further highlighted the gap. The desire for Western consumer goods, the styliagi, style hunters, chasing jeans and jazz records became a defining feature of late Soviet society. This obsession represented something deeper, a yearning for a life of dignity, comfort, and individual choice, the kind of normal life that Ivan had glimpsed in that East Prussian farmhouse. When Mikhail Gorbachev launched his policies of glasnost openness and perestroika restructuring in the late 1980s, the accumulated disillusionment burst forth. The admission that the Soviet system had failed was driven in large part by the realization that it could not compete with the West. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was the culmination of this long process of ideological decay, and the first cracks in the foundation appeared in the winter of 1945, in the kitchens and bathrooms of ordinary German homes. Lev Kopelev summed up the dilemma. How could we explain to our soldiers that we were the most advanced country in the world when they saw with their own eyes that the people we were conquering lived better than we did? The Marxist dream of a worker's paradise was shattered not by ideological arguments, but by the undeniable evidence of the flush toilet, the paved road, and the wristwatch. The material gap ultimately led to a spiritual awakening, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary forces are not grand ideas, but simple, everyday objects. What other moments in history do you think a sudden exposure to a different way of life fundamentally changed a nation's destiny? Let me know in the comments below.